Westminster Abbey breathes like a living hall, candles trembling in small halos, incense curling in soft ribbons that drift through stone and timber. The nave is a corridor of faces, blurred by anticipation, bright with curiosity. Robes brush against flagstones with a hush-like tide against shingle. Trumpets rise, silver and careful, and the choir answers in layered light. Under the vaulting, every whisper seems amplified, every heartbeat part of the music. A young figure enters, slight, steady, watched by a city, by a kingdom, by a world that measures time in crowns. She pauses where the jewel-bright banners hang. Jewels throw petals of color across her gown. The eyes of ancestors look down from carved canopies and tombs, their faces patient as winter saints. The air tastes of wax and cold stone. Pages move like moths around the altar, and the great book is lifted, its gilded edges shining. Hands reach to guide her steps, ancient hands, ceremonial hands, so that each movement becomes part of a pattern rehearsed for centuries, even as the pattern must feel, to her, utterly new. The Archbishop's voice gathers the silence. Oaths are spoken with care, syllables balanced like water carried in a shallow bowl. 1,000 listeners hold their breath as if a curtain were about to raise. In galleries above, ladies lean forward, men tilt their heads, and somewhere in the sea of velvet and lace, a child stifles a sneeze. The smallest human sound in a room arranged for grandeur, yet grandeur makes room for trembling. Her fingers, gloved and pale, adjust the fabric at her wrist, one small gesture, quickly withdrawn, that says she is 18. The anointing seals a covenant older than memory. Oil touches skin, and myth settles gently upon shoulders that have known only tutors, governesses, corridors patrolled by watchful eyes. The choir swells again. The abbey's lantern seems to lift, and for a breath the building floats, stone and song, history buoyed by breath. Then the crown is carried forward, that architecture of gold and inheritance, its inner circle lined like a cradle, its outer face a ring of quiet fires. Every gem keeps its own weather, blue and green and blood-warm. The metal gleams as if it remembers every dawn it has seen. The weight surprises her when it descends. It is balanced to fit, yet more than ornament. It presses with a presence that cannot be shared. Her spine straightens, her chin steadies, and the air around her seems to thicken, as though responsibility were a climate. For a heartbeat, the world narrows to the rim upon her brow, to the cool thread of sweat at her temple, to the slight echo that rings when the scepter is placed in her hand. The abbey exhales, the realm inhales. Her youth remains visible in the line of her mouth and the brightness of her eyes. She stands as if a door has opened behind her and a horizon has opened before. Somewhere near the choir stalls, a stray murmur slips like a ripple across a lake. Blessings whispered to steady a stranger who will never again be allowed to be a stranger. People who will never speak to her feel suddenly protective, almost intimate, the way witnesses to a threshold sometimes do. Outside, bells speak to every street. Inside, her heartbeat keeps time with a nation. Then the murmur grows into a sentence that passes from lip to lip, unclaimed by any single mouth, adopted by the moment itself. May she reign long and prosper. It is half prayer, half prediction, soft as breath, strong as wish. The phrase folds into the music, into the dust motes circling in sunbeams, into the slow drift of incense. It lodges in the rafters and in the pages of newspapers that will roll through morning streets. It lodges too in her thoughts, where hope and alarm are neighbours, where the future glitters and hides its thorns. She cannot yet see how that sentence will grow roots. She cannot count the ships that will carry her name across oceans, or the miles of rail that will braid counties to capital. She cannot hear the clatter of machines that will change the sound of cities, or the distant drums that will beat in lands far beyond her windows. She does not know the rooms she will learn to love in Scotland, the rooms she will fear to enter after a certain winter, the rooms where letters from ministers will arrive heavy with consequence. At 18, she stands inside a beginning that looks like an ending, ceremony finishing, life starting again. The regalia rests upon her like a constellation newly charted. Applause unfurls in waves, patterned and careful. Trumpets blaze once more, and yet somewhere under that blaze is a quieter music, the kind that follows a traveller into sleep. It tells of carriages that will rush through lamplit streets, of portraits that will lift her image into drawing rooms on 3 continents, of coins that will carry her profile into the hands of farmers, sailors, schoolchildren. It tells, too, of quarrels in cabinets, of telegrams flashing in the night, of judgments made with a pen that must never shake. Faces blur as tears gather, relief, solemn gladness, a startle of pride. She moves with greater certainty now, guided by ritual, steadied by fabric and light. The choir's final chords drift upward and fade, leaving behind the soft hiss of candles, the shy cough, the scrape of a heel. Outside hooves stamp, banners lift in a city breeze, chimney smoke drifts like a grey river over rooftops. Inside, pageantry collapses into practicalities, trains of silk gathered in careful hands, jewels checked, doors opened, corridors cleared. The crown glitters in the half-shadow as if amused that it can be both dream and burden. Somewhere within her, a child measures the distance from nursery to nave, and feels it as a long road walked in a single morning. That child will learn to speak with a tone that steadies ministries. She will learn the faces of her people as they line the route of processions, furriers, dockhands, lace-makers, clerks, eyes lifted toward a carriage that glides like a moving room. She will keep diaries in a tidy hand, collect moments like pressed flowers, and write of dogs, of hills, of thunderstorms, of the way certain melodies remain in the ear for days. The private pulse will insist on being heard, even in public rooms. But the path that led her here began in shadows and control, and its echoes will follow her even as the anthem fades. The abbey gives her back to the day. The city receives its young sovereign as if receiving the sun. Wheels turn, harness bells jingle, crowds lean forward until the human tide becomes its own living avenue. Above all that sound, a single thought keeps its shape. Expectation, polite, relentless, inescapable. The crown has found its head. The head has found its century. Beyond the abbey walls, a thunder of cheers folds into the steady roll of London. Shop shutters tilt their glossy eyes, river traffic answers with low horns, pigeons scatter like grey confetti. She rides through it with a posture learned in mirrors, the weight upon her brow translating into a stillness that seems, to strangers, like certainty. In the carriage window the world appears in frames, each street a ribbon of faces, each face a small mirror of hope. Watchmen smile. Old soldiers salute. Children wave their handkerchiefs until their arms ache. This is the hour when myths choose their beginnings. The silk of the seat whispers as the city slides by. Somewhere a printer sets type for broadsheets that will cross the channel by morning. Somewhere a sailor reads last week's paper and wonders what sort of queen she will be. Somewhere, far from this damp air and these ringing bells, a village elder in a red dustland pronounces her name with care and binds it to stories yet to be told. The realm is larger than rooftops and bells, and its measure will be taken in journeys. In years to come, Jubilees will paint the streets, processions will lace the city with colour, ministers will come and go like tides, an empire will sketch itself over maps with confident lines that reach into deserts and forests, into mountains where the air tastes like salt iron, into harbours where steam joins wind as an engine of fate. Telegraph wires will sling news faster than rumour. Photographs will learn her face and teach it to strangers. There will be victories that smell of wet wool and gun oil, and silences that linger in empty rooms long after the last condolence has been read. Tonight, however, belongs to ceremony and to the small relief of completion. She lifts her eyes once more to the abbey lantern as the carriage turns. The gold at her brow holds steady. The city's roar thins to a purr, then a hum, then the ordinary clatter of hoof and wheel. The young queen lets breath ease from her lungs in a measured thread, and feels beneath the jewels a simple rhythm, a promise to endure, to learn, to stand when standing is required. The candlelight of Westminster dims behind her, but the glow remains, a memory stored in bone. At 18 she was crowned before the world, unaware that the crown's weight would never lift again. Before she ruled an empire, she was a prisoner in her own nursery. Kensington Palace, 1819, a quiet island of brick and garden, its corridors hushed with the footsteps of servants who never spoke above a murmur. The city beyond was already stirring toward its industrial dawn, but within these walls the air remained still, heavy with expectation. A child was born there on a grey May morning, Alexandrina Victoria, a name chosen with little ceremony, for few believed she would matter much. Yet in the delicate rhythm of her first breaths, the fragile line of Britain's future rested, unseen and uncelebrated. Her father, the Duke of Kent, was aging and sickly. Her mother, the Duchess, distant and foreign. Outside, London carried on, unaware that history had begun again in miniature. Her infancy unfolded in echoing rooms lit by cautious daylight. The palace smelled of beeswax and damp fabric, of roses grown in the orangery, and of the faint medicinal tang of her father's chamber. Portraits of forgotten royals watched from the walls, and her nursemaids moved like ghosts among them. The Duke would often lift his daughter toward the window, showing her the park below, deer grazing among the mist, the spires of churches trembling in the distance, and whisper that one day all this might belong to her. But the whisper was just more than prophecy, for too many stood between her and the throne. When fever took him before she reached her first birthday, the jest turned to a kind of omen. He left behind debts, an anxious duchess, and a child who would never know what it meant to be ordinary. The Duchess of Kent, left alone in a foreign court, leaned upon a single ally. Sir John Conroy, a man whose ambition filled every quiet corner of Kensington. Together they built what they called the system, a lattice of rules, routines, and surveillance that would shape the girls every hour. The Kensington system, they named it later, though in truth it was less a system than a cage lined with velvet. The young Victoria slept in her mother's room until adolescence, never allowed to walk down a staircase without holding an attendant's hand. She dined at precise hours, spoke only when permitted, and was denied company her mother deemed unworthy. Her tutors recorded her conduct daily. Her playtime was observed. Even her laughter was noted. Too loud, too free, too frequent, and gently suppressed. She learned early to measure her words. The palace air itself seemed to weigh upon her tongue. In her small sitting room stood a piano, a globe, and a high-backed chair where her governess, Baroness Lehzen, would sit like a watchful flame. Lehzen, stern, loyal, precise, became the one steady presence in a childhood without friends. She taught the child to read, to trace maps, to memorize the histories of kings and martyrs. Yet she also taught her to question, in small and secret ways, the authority that bound her. It was Lehzen who showed her that the world outside the palace gates was alive, that children ran, that people laughed freely, that a monarch, if she wished, could be loved as well as feared. The Duchess and Conroy did not approve of such notions. They envisioned themselves as architects of the future Queen's obedience. He would stride through corridors like an echo of power, whispering to her mother that the girl must be molded, softened, controlled. At table, he smiled as though already a regent. To the child, he was the shadow that lengthened every afternoon. She began to dream of escape, of horses she might one day ride, of lakes without boundaries, of doors that opened outward. Her diaries, written in tiny, careful script, became her only confidant. "I long to be free," she wrote once when she was scarcely 13, "to breathe as others breathe." Those diaries grew into her refuge. She filled them with sketches of flowers, of gowns she imagined wearing, of people she met only through rumor or from the windows of her carriage. The world came to her as fragments, a beggar in the park, a soldier on the road, a line of laundry caught in the wind. She loved her small dog Dash, her only unmonitored companion, for he came when she called and asked no permission. When storms rolled over the city, she would sit by the glass and watch the lightning reflect in the dark surface of the Serpentine, wondering what it might be like to stand beneath rain without a roof to answer for. Letters began to arrive from Belgium, from Uncle Leopold, her father's brother, now a king in his own right. They came on paper that smelled faintly of tobacco and travel, filled with careful advice written in a steady paternal hand. "Dearest Drina," he called her, "you must remember that duty is not a chain but a guide. You were born to serve, not to be served." She kept his letters folded in a small box, rereading them whenever Conroy's voice rose too sharply, whenever her mother's sighs filled the hallways. They became her secret education, her blueprint for the monarch she might one day become. Duty. The word glowed like a lamp in a house without warmth. Outside, the kingdom turned restlessly. George IV, bloated, extravagant and unloved, dwindled into illness. His brother, William IV, took the throne next, an aging sailor with a heart more generous than steady. The line of succession had grown perilously thin. Every year the ministers cast their eyes toward Kensington and whispered the same question: what if the child survives? And so she did. The years unfolded in quiet repetition, lessons, letters, prayers, small rebellions measured in sighs and glances. She grew, slender and self-contained, her manner neat, her voice calm, her spirit folded upon itself like a letter never sent. The palace itself grew weary around her. Its gardens, once bright with tulips, faded into moss and nettle. Rooms were locked to save on heating, curtains drawn to preserve the upholstery. Servants moved with the discreet silence of conspirators. Conroy's influence thickened in the air, but so did resentment. Even the Duchess seemed to tire of the pretense that control was love. The young princess learned to read moods as other children read storybooks. A single cough outside her door might signal inspection, a rustle of keys, reprieve. The world became an orchestra of signals she alone could interpret. By her mid-teens, The contrast between her confinement and the rumours she overheard through the servants had become unbearable. London was roaring now. Steam engines, reformers, poets, and crowds. She would peer through her window, watching carriages roll toward Hyde Park, each one a vessel of freedom. She imagined laughter spilling from their interiors, lovers whispering beneath parasols, children running in streets unguarded by protocol. She began to sketch the outlines of another life, a queen who could walk among her people, who could breathe air not filtered by approval. That image became her talisman, her invisible rebellion. The Duchess and Conroy, sensing the approach of change, pressed harder. He demanded she sign a paper appointing him as her private secretary and treasurer once she became queen. She refused. It was the first time she'd said no to anyone of consequence, and the words seemed to echo off every wall. He raged, her mother wept, but Victoria held her ground. Lehzen, in her quiet way, stood beside her like a sentinel. Afterward, the princess wrote in her diary, "They wish to rule me, but I will be myself." It was the declaration of a monarch still trapped in the body of a girl. In those final years before destiny arrived, her life balanced between dread and awakening. Her education expanded beyond rote learning. She began to study the Constitution, to ask about parliaments and laws, to imagine the machinery of rule, not as a burden, but as an instrument of justice. Yet even as her mind reached outward, her days remained the same. Prayers at dawn, lessons till noon, embroidery by lamplight. Freedom existed only in words and pages, yet that was enough. For within the silence of her room, a resolve was forming. One that no tutor, no guardian, no system could dissolve. Then, one night in June 1837, the world outside her door shifted. She was awakened before dawn by the sound of footsteps, of whispers urgent yet restrained. Candles flickered in the corridor. A messenger's boots left rainprints on the marble. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain waited beyond her threshold, pale with fatigue and ceremony. Her mother, startled from sleep, tried to follow her into the sitting room, but the young woman lifted her hand, calm, polite, immovable. She met the men alone. Her nightgown brushed the carpet as she stood before them, the air thick with wax and omen. "Your Majesty," they said. The words hung there, unsteady as the first step on ice. William IV was dead. The crown, invisible yet undeniable, had passed. For a long moment she could not speak. The world outside remained dim, the garden still wet with dawn. Yet everything within her shifted, realigned, awoke. The girl who had been watched, corrected, and confined now stood at the threshold of her own making. The air in the room seemed thinner, almost electric. Somewhere Lehzen wept. Somewhere Conroy calculated his next approach. But Victoria, for the first time, breathed as though no one were listening. Morning grew across the park, gilding the palace windows, the same panes through which she had once peered, as a lonely child now reflected a young woman crowned by circumstance. She was still only 18. The lessons of isolation had taught her patience. The years of control had taught her defiance. The letters from distant hands had taught her duty. All the fragments of her confinement gathered now into a single steady thought, that she would rule, but she would do so on her own terms. The shadows that had kept her small would become her armor. The cage had shaped the wings it sought to contain. And so, as the palace bells began to toll, and London stirred to its new dawn, the girl who once pressed her face to the nursery window prepared to open the world itself. The corridors that had once confined her now led outward, to councils, to crowds, to the uncertain theatre of rule. Behind her the ghosts of the Kensington system lingered, but ahead lay the first taste of freedom, sharp and dazzling. Before she would become the mother of an empire, she was the daughter of solitude, and solitude had made her sovereign. The morning she became queen, the rain had washed London clean. The streets glistened as if newly minted. The trees in Kensington Gardens trembled with the soft breath of dawn. Within hours, the palace that had been her prison became her kingdom. Servants moved differently now, bowing deeper, speaking softer, their eyes bright with the knowledge that the quiet girl they once guided down staircases was now sovereign over them all. Victoria, barely 18, still felt the ache of sleeplessness from the night before. Yet something in her spine had changed. The world seemed to tilt toward her, waiting. She had summoned her courage before sunrise, when the news was still new enough to feel unreal. The Duchess, shocked to find herself excluded from her daughter's first audience, lingered in the hallway in her dressing gown, while Victoria, dressed in mourning black, received the Privy Council alone. More than 100 men, lords, bishops, statesmen, filled the room, their breath heavy with the smell of ink and rain and expectation. The girl they had once dismissed as an overprotected child now stood before them, her voice clear, her hands steady upon the table. "Since it has pleased Providence," she said, "to place me in this position, I shall do my utmost to fulfill my duty toward my country." It was not merely rehearsed, it was claimed. That moment, when she signed her first official papers with a quill almost trembling, marked the quiet birth of authority. The councillors bowed, their wigs rippled like a field of pale grain. Outside, carriages thundered over cobblestones as words spread through the streets. The new queen has spoken. And she had spoken not as a child repeating her tutors, but as a ruler speaking into silence. She would later recall, with a hint of awe, that she had felt very calm, very collected, and quite equal to the occasion. Yet beneath that calmness, the years of confinement still echoed, a voice whispering from the nursery that freedom must always be defended. In the first weeks of her reign, she moved into Buckingham Palace, a place that smelled of varnish and novelty, recently renovated, still half empty of its future grandeur. The air held the scent of new paint and coal smoke. The corridors seemed endless, as though designed to remind her how far she had come from the narrow rooms of Kensington. Servants rushed to furnish her apartments, and flowers from every county filled the halls until the scent of roses and lilies lingered like incense. For the first time in her life, no one shared her bedroom. She could close a door and lock it herself. That simple click became a hymn to independence. Each morning began with papers, letters of congratulations, dispatches from ministers, petitions from strangers. Each carried a weight she was only learning to measure. The kingdom expected composure, and she wore it like a new garment. Too heavy at first, then gradually fitted to her shape. Ministers came and went with deep bows. The one who lingered most was Lord Melbourne, her first Prime Minister, 58 years old, with kind eyes that smiled before his mouth did. He was worldly, eloquent, a little weary of politics, yet renewed by the sight of her youth. To Victoria he became both tutor and confidant, a fatherly companion who understood her eagerness to rule well and her fear of making a misstep. Their mornings soon settled into rhythm. She would receive him in her drawing room, the light slanting through tall windows onto the gilded edges of correspondence. He would lean upon the back of a chair, speaking gently of ministers and policy, of what could and could not be said. She, perched attentively, listened as if the kingdom itself were a story being told for her alone. To the courtiers, their closeness seemed natural, one guiding, the other learning, but gossip began to coil in the shadows. The newspapers called her the Girl Queen, as though youth were a flaw to be examined. Every gesture, every smile shared with Melbourne became subject to rumour, but she trusted him above all others, and trust, in a palace, is both crown and danger. Her mother, still under the influence of Conroy, found herself increasingly shut out. Victoria's correspondence with the Duchess grew stiff, courteous, but cold. The old system had been dismantled with one act of coronation, yet its residue clung to the edges of her life. She moved her mother's apartments to a distant wing of the palace, a symbolic exile dressed as practicality. "I must have air," she wrote in her diary, "and I must be alone." The servants whispered that Conroy's face had turned grey with defeat, and within months he left court altogether. The cage had been broken, but the habit of vigilance remained. Even in her freedom, she looked over her shoulder for shadows. In the city, the people adored her. Crowds followed her carriage through London, hats raised, voices lifted in affectionate cheers. To them she was innocence crowned, young, radiant, unspoiled by politics. Painters rushed to capture her likeness. Printers flooded shop windows with her portrait. Coins, medals and ribbons bore her name, and every tailor claimed to copy her dresses. When she attended the theatre, applause greeted her before the curtain rose. Yet admiration, like perfume, soon turns cloying. The same public that worshipped her youth would test her resolve at its first glimpse of human error. Her first trial came sooner than expected. The year was 1839, and politics, as ever, hung on the thread of vanity. The Whigs, Melbourne's party, had lost support, forcing the Queen to summon the Tory leader, Sir Robert Peel, to form a government. Peel, cautious and proper, requested that she dismiss certain ladies of her bedchamber who were known to be aligned with the Whigs. The demand, though political, struck her as personal. These women were her friends, her first circle of companionship after years of isolation. She refused, firmly, with a spark that startled the old men of Parliament. Peel withdrew, Melbourne returned, and newspapers called it the bedchamber crisis. To some it was a small matter of court appointments. To her, it was a battle for selfhood. She wrote in her journal that night, her handwriting jagged with emotion. "They wish to dictate to me." "I will not be dictated to," Melbourne soothed her, advising tact. But she sensed even he doubted her judgment. Still the storm passed, leaving behind a sharper awareness of what it meant to rule as a woman among men who bowed with words, yet bristled in thought. From that episode she learned that affection in politics is a tide. It draws near and recedes with the moon of convenience. The following months brought the hum of industry, the restlessness of reform. Trains howled through countryside once measured in days of travel. Telegraphs whispered of a world shrinking in distance. From the palace balcony, she could see the plumes of smoke that marked London's new arteries. She began to sense that her reign would not belong to the stillness of the past, but to the pulse of change. She read dispatches about factories, child labour, and the hunger of the poor, matters once invisible to monarchs. Melbourne advised moderation. She, though young, felt a growing curiosity. What did it mean to be a sovereign in an age of engines? Yet the crown's weight was more than the sum of politics. It carried loneliness, an echo that filled even her grandest rooms. At night, When the palace clock struck 12, she would rise from her writing desk and walk the silent corridors, listening to the distant sounds of London, the rattle of carriages, the shouts of watchmen, the laughter of drunkards fading into fog. Freedom had given her solitude, power had taken away companionship. Even Leighton, once her closest guardian, now seemed more servant than friend. The young queen who had once longed for independence now discovered that independence and isolation are sometimes the same thing. She filled her days with work, correspondence, and careful observation of her ministers. When Parliament opened, she sat in state, jewels heavy upon her throat, the air thick with ceremony. The chamber shimmered with heat and candlelight, and her speech, written by Melbourne, delivered in her voice, carried across the assembly like a thread of silver. Members craned to hear her, more moved by the sight than the substance. Outside, the crowds gathered again, cheering the sound of her name rather than the policy it represented. She smiled from her carriage window, yet inside she wondered if they saw her, or only the story they needed to believe. By the end of that year, the glow of novelty began to fade. Rumours swirled that the Queen was too dependent on her Prime Minister, that Melbourne's influence over her bordered on improper. Cartoonists drew them side by side, mentor and pupil, the elder guiding the naive. The whispers reached her ears, and though she dismissed them publicly, they left their mark. She began to study politics with greater rigour, seeking to master what others presumed she did not understand. Behind closed doors, she read constitutional treatises, analysed cabinet minutes, and asked questions that startled even her tutors. The girl once schooled to silence now spoke with authority that startled those accustomed to being obeyed. Through these years, her diary remained the true companion of her mind. Each entry, written before bed by candlelight, recorded not just events but emotions, the shape of a day, the texture of conversation, the weight of loneliness, the flicker of hope. She wrote of the weather, of small kindnesses, of the way the palace smelled of lilacs in May. Sometimes she confessed exhaustion, sometimes delight at a new painting or a song. The diary became her invisible throne, a space where she ruled only herself. When her uncle spoke of arranging a marriage, she turned the subject aside. Marriage, to her, sounded suspiciously like confinement under another name. Yet the idea lingered, shaped by letters from Leopold, and the quiet knowledge that her duty extended beyond her own heart. She had met her cousin Albert years before, a shy young man from Coburg, with a reflective face and serious eyes. Their meeting had been formal, brief, almost awkward, but the memory lingered in the back of her thoughts like the final note of a song not yet finished. For now, she told herself, she would rule alone, though history was already moving to prove otherwise. By 1840, the city had grown accustomed to its young sovereign. Her portrait hung in parlours and shop windows. Her presence in processions drew tears from strangers. The newspapers that once mocked her inexperience now praised her poise. Yet she sensed the fragility of that affection. The cheers of London could turn to silence at the first rumour of scandal. She walked the edge of public love and private fear, her every gesture both genuine and rehearsed. Still, she persevered. Each morning's council was another small conquest, each signature another act of quiet rebellion against the expectations that she should simply endure. The loneliness of her position began to settle into her bones, familiar as breath, and yet beneath it, curiosity stirred. Letters arrived from Albert once more, thoughtful and precise, speaking of music, art, and reform. She read them by lamplight, the corners of her mouth softening with each line. Perhaps she thought the crown could be shared, not in power, but in purpose. The idea frightened and comforted her in equal measure. The same heart that once trembled at the thought of obedience now longed for understanding. By the time the winter of 1839 faded into spring, Victoria had grown into her title. The frightened child of Kensington was gone. In her place stood a young woman who understood the language of ceremony, the rhythm of authority, the delicate dance of influence. The bedchamber crisis had scarred her pride, but it had also taught her to guard it. Melbourne's mentorship had guided her hand, but soon she would learn to write her own commands. The crown, once heavy, now felt like part of her bearing, a second heartbeat above her brow. She often stood by the windows of Buckingham Palace at dusk, watching the city flicker with new lights, gas lamps along the Mall, carriages winding toward Piccadilly, the river glinting with reflections of a changing world. She would rest her hand against the glass and imagine all those unseen lives beyond it. The machinists, the seamstresses, the children in narrow alleys. Somewhere among them were the subjects she had sworn to serve, and though she did not yet know their names, she could feel their existence as a kind of hum beneath the surface of her own. It was there, between solitude and duty, that she began to discover what sovereignty truly meant. The girl who once looked out from a nursery window now gazed down from a palace balcony upon a nation in motion. Behind her, the rooms glowed with candlelight and polished silver. Before her, the night stretched wide and restless. She had waited her whole life for freedom, only to find that liberty came chained to duty. But she did not flinch. In the stillness of that moment, she understood that the path ahead would be long, marked by love and labor, by triumph and grief. And somewhere, just beyond the horizon of her reign, the faint outline of destiny was beginning to take shape, waiting for the knock at the door that would change her life once again. The spring of 1840 arrived with a scent of lilac and inevitability. In Buckingham Palace, the young queen paced the length of her drawing room, her heart quick with the knowledge that soon she must choose, not as monarch, but as woman. The letters from Coburg had grown more frequent, measured, thoughtful pages in Albert's hand, filled with reflections on music, science, and virtue. Each one had been carefully composed, yet between the lines, something warmer lived. Victoria had read them by candlelight, tracing the ink as though it were pulse. And so, when at last he arrived in England once more, tall and earnest in his German uniform, she felt her composure falter. He bowed, she smiled, and the room itself seemed to exhale. For days she weighed the question of affection against that of sovereignty. No queen had proposed marriage before, and none advised it. Yet she, who had spent her youth being told what to do, would not let custom dictate her heart. On a grey morning in October, she sent for him. In the small blue sitting room of Buckingham Palace, she spoke first, her voice steady, her eyes bright. "I thought you must be aware why I wished you to come," she said, and when he met her gaze, the air between them trembled like the pause before music. "It would make me very happy," she whispered, "if you would consent to marry me." He answered without hesitation. Their engagement, though only minutes old, already felt ancient, as though written somewhere long before their births. When he left the room, she sat by the window for a long time, hands clasped in her lap, overwhelmed by the strangeness of happiness. "I never spent such an evening," she wrote that night. "My dearest, dearest Albert. His affection gives me feelings of heavenly love and happiness I never could have hoped to feel before." Outside, the city stirred with rumors. Inside, a private kingdom had begun. The wedding followed swiftly, February 10th, 1840. Rain fell over London, turning the streets to mirrors. Crowds lined the route from Buckingham Palace to St. James's Palace, their umbrellas like a field of black tulips. Within the chapel, the air shimmered with candlelight and breath. She wore white satin trimmed with orange blossoms, her veil a gift of Honiton lace. He stood beside her in silver and crimson, his face grave with emotion. The choir sang, the organ swelled, and when she placed her hand in his, the nation sighed as one. It was not only a union of two hearts, but of two ideals: love and duty, private longing and public symbol. Later that evening, the palace glowed with celebration. The streets outside rang with cheers, and the bells of London pealed until dawn. Inside, behind curtains heavy with embroidery, Victoria wept quietly, not with sorrow, but with the kind of joy that overwhelms the body. She wrote again in her diary, "I never spent such an evening. My dearest, dear Albert. His affection gave me feelings of heavenly love and happiness I never could have hoped to feel before." The repetition was her truth. Happiness, once theoretical, had become tangible. The first months of marriage were a delicate dance between intimacy and authority. She, queen of an empire; he, prince without a crown. The court, always hungry for intrigue, watched to see which of them would yield. Yet Albert, though proud, had no hunger for domination. He sought not to eclipse her, but to join her light. He studied state papers, attended audiences, and gradually earned her ministers' respect through intellect and patience. In their private hours, he was husband and companion, correcting her German with gentle amusement, sketching beside her at the table, playing the organ in quiet evenings after dinner. Their household soon became a model of moral order. Albert rose early, bathed in cold water, and worked with the discipline of a scholar. He designed nurseries, drew plans for new plumbing, and insisted on household economies that startled courtiers accustomed to extravagance. Victoria adored his steadiness, even as it revealed her own temper. "We are of very different natures," she wrote, "but we complement one another." And indeed their contrasts were their strength, her impulsive warmth met by his logic, her spontaneity balanced by his calm. Together, they made the monarchy seem human. In November of that same year, their first child was born, a daughter, christened Victoria. The labour was long, and the Queen's cries echoed down the corridor. Albert waited outside her chamber, pacing the floor, until the doctor emerged with relief on his face. When the infant's cry filled the air, he fell to his knees. "Poor dear child," Victoria wrote after. "It was a blessed moment." Her motherhood arrived like a second crown, unexpected and irreversible. She, who had been shaped by absence, now felt the fierce tenderness of possession. The years that followed unfolded in the rhythm of domesticity. Between audiences and dispatches came the laughter of children. Between ceremonies, the chaos of toys and tutors. The royal nursery grew by the year. Edward, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, Beatrice, 9 in all. The palace rang with their noise. Ministers waiting in antechambers could hear the thud of small feet overhead, the barking of dogs, the scolding of nurses. Even the grand corridors seemed softened by it. She, once imprisoned in childhood, gave her own brood the freedom she had been denied. Pony rides, open air, affection unmeasured. And yet, beneath the laughter, the machinery of empire continued to turn. Albert, restless for purpose, threw himself into public service. He became patron of art and science, champion of modern design, and architect of the Great Exhibition of 1851, a vast glass palace raised in Hyde Park to display the wonders of industry. It was his triumph, and through him, hers. The world came to London that summer. Engineers from Europe, merchants from India, travellers from lands barely mapped. The Crystal Palace shimmered like ice in sunlight, and beneath its arches, humanity paraded its inventions: steam engines, looms, telescopes, jewels, fossils, and machines that stitched faster than any human hand. Victoria toured the exhibition at Albert's side, her gown brushing the iron floor, her eyes wide with awe. "This day," she wrote, "will ever be the proudest and happiest of my life." To her, the exhibition was not mere spectacle, but proof that progress could be beautiful, that the empire's reach might serve enlightenment, not just conquest. The people adored them for it. Newspapers called them the model sovereigns, and even the skeptics of monarchy confessed that something noble had reawakened in the institution. Their partnership was not without friction. She was passionate, quick-tempered, prone to bursts of jealousy. He, methodical and private, inclined to correct. Their quarrels were storms in miniature, sudden, intense, soon dissolved in tears and reconciliation. Once, after an argument over political correspondence, she fled to her room and locked the door. He stood outside, silent, until she emerged hours later, her anger melted by remorse. "I am so foolish," she admitted, "and you are so good." To which he replied simply, "We are one." It became the refrain of their life together. In the evenings, they would retreat to their private apartments, the candles burning low, the scent of ink and paper filling the air. He read aloud from Goethe or Shakespeare. She stitched or wrote letters to her children's tutors. Sometimes they played duets on the piano, his fingers precise, hers emotional. When the music ended, the quiet felt sacred. Beyond those walls the empire expanded, Canada settling its borders, New Zealand opening to settlers, India tightening under British rule. But within, the royal household remained its own small universe, anchored by love. She adored him to the point of worship. "Without him," she wrote, "everything loses its interest." Ministers learned to read her moods by the tone of his. If Albert smiled, the court breathed easier. If he frowned, they braced for storm. His influence grew until he was, in all but title, her co-sovereign. Some whispered uneasily about a German prince directing English affairs, but she silenced them with a glance. "The prince is my best and truest friend," she declared. And in truth, he was the axis on which her world turned. In 1853, she gave birth to their 8th child. The process nearly cost her life, and for weeks afterward, she was pale and feverish. Albert nursed her himself, reading to her in German to keep her mind calm. "He watched by me," she wrote, "with such care and devotion that I felt blessed beyond words." Recovery brought new gratitude and new fear. For the first time, she glimpsed the possibility of loss. When he left for even a few days, she grew anxious. When he returned, she clung to him with an intensity that alarmed her ladies-in-waiting. "I cannot exist without him," she confessed. Their love was both strength and vulnerability. He became the moral compass of her reign, urging moderation in policy, compassion in law. He advised her through the turbulence of the 1848 revolutions in Europe, when monarchs fell like leaves in storm. "Trust your people," he told her, "and they will trust you." His faith in progress steadied her fear of chaos. When unrest flared in Ireland, he urged relief rather than repression. When disputes arose in Parliament, he reminded her that patience could wield more power than decree. Through him, she began to see the crown not as shield, but as service. In those same years, her fame spread beyond measure. Across the empire, her image became currency. Statues rose in Calcutta and Cape Town. Towns in Canada and Australia bore her name. To millions she was both distant and familiar, a mother they would never meet, yet whose face adorned their coins. The telegraph carried her messages across continents, compressing geography into heartbeat. The empire seemed invincible, its power sanctified by her domestic virtue. She and Albert appeared not only rulers, but symbols of a moral age. Yet the perfection that glittered in portraits hid the quiet exhaustion beneath. 9 children, constant audiences, and the endless machinery of monarchy left her weary. She longed for Balmoral, the Scottish estate Albert had purchased, a wilderness of mist and pine where they could walk unguarded among the heather. There, the Queen became simply wife, and the Prince, Papa. They rode through glens, fished in cold rivers, and ate by firelight, their boots muddy, their laughter echoing against the hills. In those moments, she felt more herself than in all the gilded halls of London. Time, however, was changing, even as they paused to rest within it. The empire grew hungrier, the public louder. Reformers demanded justice for the poor, newspapers demanded transparency from power, and colonies demanded attention rather than indifference. Albert, visionary that he was, saw the storm approaching. He tried to modernize the monarchy, to make it moral, scientific, efficient. He founded commissions, planned schools, studied railways, and advised on sanitation. She watched him work late into the night, his candle burning long after hers had gone out. Sometimes she rose quietly, stepped into his study, and touched his shoulder. "You work too hard," she murmured. He smiled without looking up. "There is too much to be done." When dawn came, London smoked and clattered below their windows, the sound of an empire forging itself anew. They had built a world that seemed untouchable, a dynasty rooted in affection, a monarchy modern in spirit, a partnership envied by every court in Europe. And yet, even as she wrote of their happiness, the first shadows had begun to gather at the edges of their story. The doctors spoke in hushed tones of his health. Nothing serious, they said. He tired easily. He needed rest. She dismissed their warnings, unwilling to imagine a day without his presence beside her chair. In the summer of 1861, Albert rode through rain to visit their son at Cambridge, already feverish before he left. By December he was confined to bed, pale and gasping. She sat beside him through the night, her hand clutching his, whispering prayers in broken German. The physicians called it typhoid. He, ever gentle, tried to soothe her even as life ebbed away. "Don't be anxious, dear child," he murmured. "I shall go first." His final breath came just before midnight. The clock in the corridor struck the hour, and silence followed. She remained at his bedside, frozen in disbelief. "There is no one," she wrote, "to call me Victoria now. The world outside would call her queen, empress, mother of empire, but inside she was widowed, hollowed, undone." The light of their shared life dimmed, and every corridor of the palace seemed to echo his absence. She ordered his rooms left untouched, his clothes folded as if he might return. Black crape covered her mirrors. From that night on she wore mourning. The nation mourned with her, but none so deeply as she. Together they had made the monarchy a home, until fate left her alone in its halls. His death marked not an ending, but a long descent into shadow. The years of laughter and partnership became legend, their warmth remembered as myth. Yet through it all, her love endured, fierce and unbending, a torch carried through grief. The young queen who had once defied her guardians now defied mortality itself, keeping his memory alive with the devotion of the devout. The age that would bear their name had begun in harmony, but in its silence, only her voice remained. The decade after Albert's death unfolded like a long winter. The palace that once pulsed with laughter now sat in perpetual twilight. Curtains remained drawn, the clocks muffled, and the air smelled faintly of dust and rosewater. Victoria moved through those corridors like a ghost who remembered being alive. Yet beyond her grief, the Empire had no patience for stillness. The world was changing faster than any queen could mourn. Steam, iron, and ambition remade the face of Britain. And in the flicker of that transformation, Victoria found herself drawn again toward life, not by joy, but by duty. The empire was expanding. The Industrial Revolution thundered across her kingdom, its rhythm the heartbeat of a new century. Factories rose like cathedrals of smoke. Railways cut through the countryside in gleaming threads of iron. Cities swelled with workers, their chimneys exhaling the future into the grey sky. In the hum of machinery, there was both promise and peril, the marvel of progress and the misery of its price. Children laboured beside engines that hissed like dragons, women stitched through the night by gaslight. And yet, for the first time, the common man could travel, read, communicate, and dream beyond his station. Victoria watched from afar, half in awe, half in disquiet. She saw that her realm was no longer the agrarian island of her ancestors, but the workshop of the world. When she travelled by rail, the countryside rushed past her carriage window like a living tapestry. Villages, mills, fields, and towns threaded together by smoke and wire. The whistle of the train sounded to her like a hymn to progress, and yet it carried an undertone of mourning. For every invention born, something ancient seemed to vanish, the quiet of the fields, the rhythm of old lives measured by the church bell instead of the factory horn. The telegraph, too, was transforming the pulse of empire. Messages crossed oceans faster than ships could sail. A thought conceived in London might reach Bombay in hours. The world was shrinking, its borders stitched by copper veins. She marvelled at it and feared it in equal measure. That distance itself, once the sovereign's greatest shield, had become a ghost. Ministers could now reach her with news before she could sleep. Disasters arrived at her breakfast table with their smoke still rising. The empire, once a distant constellation, was now a web, and at its centre sat a widow in black, learning how to reign in the age of speed. Her people, who had pitied her mourning, began to grow restless. They wanted their queen to return to them, to stand again as the symbol of stability in an age of flux. But she resisted the pageantry that once delighted her. Public appearances exhausted her. She wrote from Balmoral instead, her letters full of affection and apology. "I am not insensible," she told her ministers, "but my heart is too heavy." Yet even in retreat, her hand guided the machinery of empire, approving laws, reading dispatches, sending condolences to widows of fallen soldiers she had never met. Her sorrow had not lessened her sense of responsibility, it had only deepened it. Then came war, the Crimean Campaign of 1853. fought on frozen plains and fevered trenches far from her view. The first photographs of war arrived in London, and for the first time the faces of soldiers reached their queen not as names, but as living ghosts caught in silver light. The public, unprepared for such images, demanded justice and care. Out of that cry rose a woman whose name would become legend, Florence Nightingale. Victoria followed Nightingale's reports with rapt attention. The accounts of filth, suffering, and neglect in the military hospitals enraged her. She sent orders for supplies, wrote letters to ministers, and later met the nurse herself, frail, intense, her hands still trembling from years of exhaustion. "You have shown what a woman may do," Victoria told her, and meant it. She established medals for bravery and wrote personally to soldiers' families. The war was distant, yet its echoes filled every corridor of the palace. For a queen who had loved and lost, every casualty was a reminder of the man who would have comforted her through it. When peace finally returned, it brought neither triumph nor rest. The year 1857 delivered a far deeper wound, a rebellion that would transform her empire and her reign alike. In India, the mutiny of sepoys against the East India Company erupted into brutal chaos. Reports arrived of massacres and retaliations, of cities burning, of innocent lives crushed beneath the wheel of vengeance. The dispatches were slow at first, then relentless. Victoria read them by candlelight, her hand trembling over each page. "It is too dreadful," she wrote, "that my name should be connected to such horrors." She sought to understand what had gone wrong, why those who served under the British flag now rose against it. Ministers spoke of mutiny and treason, others whispered of arrogance, neglect, and cultural blindness. The empire had grown too vast, too sure of itself. The company that ruled in her name had governed through profit, not compassion. For the first time she began to grasp the double-edged nature of dominion. "If we rule," she told her advisers, "we must rule justly, not as masters, but as guardians." When the rebellion was finally crushed, the cost was incalculable. The East India Company was dissolved, and India passed directly under the crown. A new order was proclaimed. She, Victoria Regina, would now be sovereign over a realm that stretched from the English Channel to the Himalayas. She had never seen those mountains, yet poets called them the walls of her dominion. The sun, they said, never set upon her empire. But in her diary she wrote only, "How strange that I, who never asked to rule so far, must now answer for so many." To the British public, this moment marked a triumph. The empire was reborn under royal authority, and its queen became the emblem of unity. In paintings, she was shown crowned, serene, her face ageless. Britannia in flesh. The reality was quieter, lonelier. She had not left her mourning dress. Even as telegraph wires buzzed with news of progress, she sat by the fire at Osborne House, reading Albert's old notes on governance. His handwriting seemed to speak to her still. "He would have known what to do," she wrote. "I only do what I think he would have wished." But life, even for the grief-stricken, does not remain still. The world's inventions demanded her attention, its momentum her assent. In the 1860s, new marvels arrived in quick succession: the sewing machine, the submarine cable, the first ironclad ships. Engineers and inventors wrote to her for patronage. Reformers begged her to lend her name to their causes. Though she rarely appeared in public, her influence radiated through the ink of her pen. When she granted an audience, the effect was electric. Ministers left her presence speaking of renewed faith, as though her solitude itself had become a symbol of endurance. The empire's reach extended not only across the seas, but into the fabric of daily life. Britain's merchants traded in coal, cotton, and conscience. London's docks overflowed with goods from every corner of the globe. Indian spices, Australian wool, African ivory, Caribbean sugar. The scent of empire was everywhere, in the smoke of factories, in the perfume of markets, in the polished wood of furniture carved in Bombay and sold in Mayfair. Victoria's face watched over it all from coins, stamps, and engravings, the still eye of a restless storm. And yet, she remained deeply human amid the machinery of grandeur. Her letters to her children were full of tenderness and reprimand, her tone shifting between mother and monarch. She scolded her sons for extravagance, her daughters for melancholy, always reminding them that theirs was a family of example. "Remember," she wrote, "that our lives are not our own." When her eldest daughter married the Crown Prince of Prussia, she wept for days, torn between pride and loss. "They go," she said, "and yet they remain mine in heart." The empire was vast, but her love was measured in rooms and letters, in the ache of separation. In these years, the world began to call her the grandmother of Europe. Her children's marriages stitched dynasties together as effectively as her armies joined continents. Each alliance promised peace and carried the seed of future conflict. But in the 1860s, those storms were still distant. For now, the Queen's brood filled the courts of Europe with echoes of her voice and her virtues: discipline, piety, restraint. It was as though the entire continent had been touched by the quiet insistence of her will. When she ventured once more into public life, the effect was overwhelming. Crowds that had grown critical in her absence now wept at the sight of her carriage. She was no longer the radiant young queen of the 1840s, but something greater, a figure of memory itself, the living embodiment of continuity. Her veil fluttered, her black gown shimmered faintly beneath the sun, and her face, pale and resolute, reflected both sorrow and strength. "The people are so kind," she wrote afterward, "and I hope they know how deeply I feel it." Her correspondence with her prime ministers, from Palmerston to Disraeli, became a dance of persuasion and rivalry. She distrusted Palmerston's bluster, admired Peel's integrity, and later found in Disraeli a charm that almost pierced her mourning. He flattered her with poetry and politics, calling her the Fairy Queen, a title that made her blush and frown at once. Through him, she rediscovered a sliver of her former self, a monarch who could delight in wit and wield influence through warmth rather than decree. Under her watch, the British Empire entered what historians would later call its Golden Age. Colonies became dominions, dominions became myths. The map was painted red from Canada to the Cape, from the Caribbean to Calcutta. Steamships carried goods, ideas, and diseases across oceans. Missionaries followed traders, and administrators followed missionaries. The empire had become a living organism, its heartbeat mechanical, its soul uncertain. And through it all, Victoria sat at its center, a figure of stability in a world of velocity. In the quiet hours of night, she would still speak to Albert's portrait. "You see," she would whisper, "they still need us." His absence had become her theology. The empire was her penance, the endless labor of ruling without the hand that once steadied hers. But through that labor, she built something enduring, a monarchy that could outlive even grief. The world quickened under steam and steel, and her empire stretched with it. Factories, Telegraphs and railways bound her people together in motion, while across the seas the Union Jack climbed new masts in distant harbours. In the hum of progress, the Queen's voice remained constant, a thread of human steadiness in a century that had forgotten how to pause. Beneath her watch, Britain became an empire of movement, and yet, at its heart, there remained one still figure, dressed in black, holding together the world that Albert had left behind. The years after Albert's death never truly healed. They only changed colour, from the stark black of mourning to the muted grey of habit. Grief became the air she breathed, invisible, constant, shaping the timbre of her voice and the pace of her walk. The palace servants grew accustomed to her silence, to the sound of doors opening softly and closing without echo. The public, once indulgent, began to whisper. The Widow of Windsor, they called her, a phrase that clung to her like the mourning veil itself. But though the world mistook her seclusion for indifference, it was not absence she sought. It was survival. In the winter of 1861, when Albert's death stilled the palace, she had imagined she might soon follow him. My life, she wrote, as a happy one, is ended. The world is gone for me. Yet the world refused to end. It demanded signatures, decrees, and appearances. Ministers begged her to resume her public duties. She retreated instead to Balmoral, then to Osborne House, hiding from the machinery of empire that no longer felt like her own. She wore black, not as costume but as armour, a way of saying to the world, do not ask me to be more than what remains. But duty, like time, does not stop for sorrow. Every morning, dispatch boxes arrived heavy with correspondence, war reports, petitions, letters of condolence for strangers she would never meet. She opened them one by one, her handwriting still precise, her mind still sharp. The Queen has no wish for display, she told her ministers, but she will not neglect her work. In that discipline, grief became function. The world could change its seasons. She would remain constant. In public, her silence became myth. The newspapers called her reclusive. Caricaturists drew her as a ghost ruling from behind curtains. But the people, though restless, did not forsake her. They spoke of her as one might speak of an old cathedral, sombre, unchanging, necessary. Her portrait, veiled and solemn, appeared in every household. To the poor she was a widow like themselves, proof that even queens could know loss. To others, her mourning seemed to sanctify the age. The Victorian world itself became defined by restraint, sobriety, and endurance. And yet, in the solitude of Balmoral, another kind of companionship quietly entered her life. His name was John Brown, a Highland servant with broad shoulders, weathered hands, and a devotion as unpolished as it was unyielding. He had served Albert in Scotland, leading his horse through the glens. Now, in her widowhood, he served her with the same fierce loyalty, refusing to treat her as a relic. He spoke plainly, sometimes too plainly, calling her woman when others said majesty. She found his bluntness disarming, his honesty medicinal. In his company, she could breathe without ceremony. The courtiers despised him. They muttered of insolence, of impropriety, of influence beyond his station. Yet she trusted him more than she did any of them. He guarded her solitude, rode beside her through the misty hills, fetched her shawl when she forgot it, and scolded her for working too long. Brown is the only one who knows how to manage me, she said. His presence at her side became an emblem of both defiance and dependence. The newspapers mocked them cruelly, the Queen and her Highland servant, but she did not care. "He is my friend," she wrote, "and I cannot be ashamed of friendship." Their bond, whatever shape it truly took, was her return to the living world. In the evenings at Balmoral she would sit by the fire while Brown read aloud from the local papers, his accent thick as the peat smoke. Sometimes she laughed, quietly, almost guiltily, at his wit. Those who witnessed it called it a resurrection of sorts, a queen rediscovering the small pulse of life. She would never wear colour again, never dance, never enter a ballroom. But in those brief Highland summers, she began to walk with a steadier step. Yet England was less forgiving than the hills of Scotland. As the years passed, her absence from London became a matter of politics. Crowds gathered at public events asking, "Where is our Queen?" Radical papers accused her of neglect. Some even spoke of abolishing the monarchy altogether. The thought terrified her ministers, for though she had hidden herself, her image remained the glue of empire. Without her, the realm's sentiment might dissolve. Letters poured into Balmoral pleading for her return. "They do not understand," she told her daughter. "I cannot show the face they wish to see, the one that died with him." Still, time and necessity conspired to draw her back. In 1866, she appeared in London for the opening of Parliament, her first major public ceremony in years. The city erupted in welcome. Crowds packed the streets, their cheers shaking the air. The carriage windows fogged with breath as people pressed forward to glimpse her, their veiled, grieving queen. She raised her gloved hand slightly, acknowledging them with the faintest nod. It was not triumph, but reconciliation, a silent exchange between ruler and ruled. "I am still here. You are still mine." The empire itself seemed to mirror her paradox, power laced with melancholy. While she mourned, Britain built. Steamships circled the globe, colonies multiplied, railways laced India and Africa with tracks of ambition. Each telegram from abroad brought tidings of expansion, of wars won, and treaties signed. Yet the queen who presided over it all still wrote, "I am so weary of the world." Ministers saw her as the unchanging face of empire, but she saw herself as its echo, a presence that lingered while the living moved on. Her children, too, became symbols of her endurance. They married into Europe's royal families, Prussia, Denmark, Russia, weaving alliances that turned the continent into a tapestry of kinship. But motherhood for Victoria was never simple. She adored her children, yet her love was anxious, controlling, and easily wounded. She expected gratitude, found independence insolence, and often mourned the loss of her authority over them more than she celebrated their happiness. "They go," she wrote bitterly, "and I am left." When her son Edward, charming, restless, too like the father he resembled, fell into scandal after scandal, she despaired. "He will break my heart," she confided. The relationship between mother and heir became the quiet battlefield of her later life. Edward, who would one day be king, saw her as both monarch and mother, neither role forgiving. She saw in him the impatience of youth and the threat of modernity. He represented the world beyond mourning, a world of pleasure, gossip, and speed. Their exchanges were cordial in public, tense in private. "He is good at heart," she admitted, "but weak." When he tried to reconcile, she softened, but never entirely. The empire could be ruled with compromise. Motherhood, never. Her other children fared better, if only because distance softened her expectations. Letters arrived from Berlin, Copenhagen, and St. Petersburg, filled with news of births and politics. She answered each one by hand, her ink-black grief pressed into every page. "Remember your duty," she wrote again and again, as if writing the command into herself. Duty had become the organ by which she continued to live. By the late 1860s, the public had begun to understand her solitude differently. The newspapers that once condemned her now romanticized her sorrow. Poets wrote of her as a woman of marble heart, steadfast against time. Photographs of her, draped in widow's black, were sold like icons. Even her critics found themselves disarmed. She had turned mourning into monarchy, sorrow into sovereignty. The people no longer demanded her joy, they revered her endurance. And still, through it all, John Brown remained, her living proof that warmth could survive under frost. When she fell ill, he nursed her with the same fierce care Albert once had. When she refused food, he scolded her. When she wept, he stood silently beside her until the tears passed. "He is rough," she wrote, "but he loves me truly." When his own health began to fail in 1883, she felt the old dread rising again, the dread of being left behind. His death, when it came, struck her with a shock that reopened every old wound. "Life," she wrote simply, "has lost its last link with comfort." In the quiet after his passing, she turned once more to her papers, to letters, memoranda, petitions. The empire would not stop for her grief. Perhaps, she realized, that was its mercy. The unending work of monarchy became her refuge once again. She approved reforms in sanitation and education, wrote to bereaved families after shipwrecks, and sent condolences to widows of soldiers fallen in distant lands. Her handwriting never faltered. "The Queen does not forget," she would sign, as though memory itself were her throne. By 1870, when the decade drew to its close, she had remade herself entirely. The black dress remained, but the woman inside it had grown harder, quieter, immovable. The people who once pitied her now looked to her as a symbol of fortitude. Ministers came and went, empires rose and fell. Through it all she remained, the solitary heart at the center of a restless age. The empire still cheered her name, but its queen had vanished into shadow. To the world she was a monument, to herself a memory in motion. The black years, as history would call them, were her crucible, and from them she emerged not lighter, but unbreakable. When the 1870s dawned, Victoria was no longer the grieving figure who had once retreated into silence. Her sorrow had cooled into something like strength, still present, still heavy, but refined into steel. The nation that had pitied her now looked upon her with reverence. She was no longer simply the widow of Albert, but the matriarch of an empire whose power had reached its farthest edge. In her solitude, she had become the symbol of stability itself. The British people, weary of revolutions and uncertain futures, found comfort in her constancy. But history has little patience for stillness, and before long her quiet reign would find a new pulse, drawn not from love or grief, but from empire. The man who helped awaken that pulse was Benjamin Disraeli. He entered her life like a gust of colour through a grey corridor, charming, florid, and entirely unlike the cautious statesman who had preceded him. He flattered her not with servility, but with admiration that seemed almost poetic. "You have only to reign, ma'am," he told her, "and you reign over us all." He sent her novels and verses, addressed her letters with wit and affection, and never forgot to praise her intelligence. "No sovereign," he wrote, "has ever understood the art of rule so intuitively. She, who had lived decades surrounded by formality and veiled resentment, found his warmth intoxicating. "He is full of genius, poetry, and charm," she told her daughters. "He makes me feel as if I were a woman again." Disraeli, for his part, saw in her not just a monarch, but a partner in vision. The empire, he said, was not merely a map of red territories, it was the destiny of a civilization. "England," he declared, "is a great Asiatic power." The phrase lingered in her thoughts. For years she had ruled over lands she had never seen, her name inscribed upon distant coins, her face engraved upon silver and copper. Now, he invited her to see herself as something grander, the empress of a world knit together by steam, telegraph, and will. In 1876, his words became law. Parliament passed the Royal Titles Act, and Victoria, once the secluded widow, the lonely girl of Kensington, the trembling bride, became officially Empress of India. The title thrilled her. "It is most gratifying," she wrote, "that I should at last have a name that truly represents the greatness of my empire." The ceremony itself was modest, for she was too cautious to seem vainglorious, but in the halls of power it marked a transformation. The empire had found its myth, and the queen, her second crown. The news raced across the telegraph lines, carried by the same wires that bound her dominion together. In Calcutta and Bombay, in Rangoon and Lahore, fireworks lit the skies. Local rulers sent messages of loyalty written on gold-leaf parchment, sealed with jeweled crests. The London Illustrated News declared her Queen of the World. Even her critics admitted that the empire had never seemed more united. Yet behind the glitter of ceremony, a quiet unease stirred. India was not a jewel freely offered, but one wrested through conquest and administration. The title of Empress, though meant to inspire loyalty, also masked the growing distance between ruler and ruled. Still, for Victoria, it was not conquest, but connection that mattered. India fascinated her, its languages, colours, and customs. She devoured travelogues, studied maps, and filled her rooms with gifts sent from the subcontinent. Silks embroidered with gold thread, carved ivory fans, boxes of sandalwood that scented her sitting rooms. The empire, though she had never seen it, became for her a living presence, a landscape of imagination. "How beautiful it must be," she wrote, "where my name is spoken beneath so many suns." In the late 1870s, as her fascination deepened, she began to take Hindi lessons from her new Indian attendants, among them a young man named Abdul Karim. At first, he was merely a servant assigned to her household during the Jubilee celebrations, chosen to present an official token from India. But something in his quiet dignity and dark eyes drew her attention. She made him her munshi, her teacher, instructing her in language and customs. "He is very gentle," she noted, "and so intelligent." Soon she was writing in Urdu, peppering her notes with phrases that astonished her courtiers. "We are all children under heaven," she told Karim once, "and God has made no one higher or lower than another." Her affection for him scandalized the court. Ministers muttered, her children fumed, and newspapers dripped with insinuations. "It is improper," they whispered, "for the Queen to favour a native servant." But Victoria ignored them all. She had spent her youth trapped by the expectations of others. She would not let her widowhood be ruled by their prejudice. To her, Abdul was not an emblem of politics, but a reminder of vitality, of the living empire she had been crowned to rule. "He gives me new interest in my Indian subjects," she wrote, "and restores to me a sense of youth." Her renewed curiosity about the wider world coincided with the empire's relentless expansion. Steamships connected London to Calcutta in less than 3 weeks. Telegraph cables ran beneath oceans like arteries, carrying orders and news faster than any horse or sail could have done. Colonial exhibitions transformed the empire into theatre, vast spectacles where the products and peoples of far-off lands were displayed under glass domes for curious Londoners. At the great exhibitions airs, in South Kensington, in Paris, in Vienna, visitors wandered through pavilions of palm trees and porcelain, marvelling at the empire under one roof. Victoria followed reports of these exhibitions with both pride and melancholy. She was pleased that her empire dazzled the world, yet uneasy at the thought of people reduced to curiosities. "They are subjects, not specimens," she once remarked. Still, she lent her name to every such endeavour, believing that the empire's unity depended upon the imagination as much as on law or army. In her letters to Disraeli, she spoke of it almost tenderly. "It is the empire, not as dominion, but as family, that must be cherished." But if Disraeli gave her grandeur, he also gave her loss once more. In 1881, his health failed. She visited him for the last time at his country home, where he lay surrounded by books and fading roses. "I have brought your Easter flowers," she told him softly. He smiled. "Ah, ma'am, you bring sunshine." He died soon after, and she wrote that evening, "A light has gone out of my life once again." For the second time, she had lost a man who understood her, not as queen or emblem, but as human. The void Disraeli left was filled by politics she barely recognized. Industrial strikes, Irish unrest, colonial conflicts, all the hum of a restless empire. Her ministers urged her to take greater ceremonial part, to be seen as the mother of her people. And so she returned to public life with renewed vigor. She presided over Jubilees, reviewed troops, opened exhibitions, and addressed Parliament with a solemn grace that seemed almost priestly. The black of her mourning gown had become its own kind of regalia. In 1887, London prepared to celebrate her Golden Jubilee, 50 years on the throne. The city became a festival of banners and bells, the streets lined with soldiers from every corner of the empire. Representatives from India rode in silks and turbans beside Canadians in fur-lined uniforms and Australians in khaki. The noise of the crowd rolled through the capital like a tide. When she appeared in her carriage, the cheers seemed to shake the very stones. "It was most moving," she wrote that night. "Everywhere loyalty and affection." The Jubilee was more than celebration. It was spectacle turned into myth. The old queen, small and veiled, rode through her capital like a relic made flesh, the embodiment of empire itself. She was no longer merely ruler, but symbol, the living thread that bound a quarter of the world's population to one crown. Children sang hymns in her honor. Poets compared her to Rome's Augustan peace. But in her private chambers that evening, she wept quietly. "How strange," she wrote, "to be loved by so many, and yet to feel so lonely." Her later years unfolded in that strange harmony, power and isolation, adoration and weariness. She continued her correspondence with Abdul Karim, now elevated to a position of trust, though the court resented him bitterly. She learned of Indian festivals, read translations of Persian poetry, and sent gifts to native schools and hospitals. For the first time in decades, her heart and her empire seemed to beat in rhythm. "It comforts me," she told her secretary, "to know that there are good hearts under other skins." But history, relentless as ever, encroached upon her serenity. Abroad, the empire's expansion was meeting its limits. Wars in Africa and Afghanistan, famine in India, unrest in Ireland, all cast shadows upon the glitter of imperial success. The world she ruled was no longer a mosaic of obedience, but a landscape of questioning voices. "They do not yet see," she told her ministers, "that loyalty must be won by kindness." In this conviction, she resembled Albert more than Disraeli, though both lived in her memory like twin stars, one of reason, the other of romance. Yet even amid disquiet, her legend grew. Painters captured her in soft pastels, her face lined but luminous. Photographers travelled to Balmoral to record her surrounded by grandchildren, the matriarch of Europe, the mother of nations. Her family tree had become a map of diplomacy, grandsons who would one day wear crowns in Britain, Germany and Russia, granddaughters who would marry into every court from Madrid to Bucharest. The web of kinship seemed unbreakable, the world bound not only by empire, but by blood. In her private life, however, she felt time closing in. "I am so tired," she confessed to her doctor. "I long for rest, but my work is not yet done." She still received ministers daily, her handwriting still firm, her mind alert. Yet she often paused mid-sentence, as if listening for the footsteps of someone she could no longer see. In her study at Osborne House, Albert's portrait still hung above her desk. His face had faded slightly, the colours soft with age. "Soon," she whispered once, touching the frame, "we shall not be apart much longer." By the late 1880s, the empire had entered its full pomp, railways across Africa, telegraphs through Asia, colonies stretching across oceans. Her name was carved on arches, stamped on coins, and sung in the hymns of schoolchildren in languages she could not speak. She ruled lands she would never see, yet her name was spoken beneath every sun. The British Empire had become, in her lifetime, the most vast political creation in human history. And yet, in the quiet of her room, she remained what she had always been, a woman still writing letters to the dead, still yearning for the world beyond her window. The age called Victorian was nearing its zenith. The Queen had become its conscience, a figure at once mortal and eternal. In her grief, she had discovered endurance, in her solitude, majesty. The child who once stared through palace windows had become the most recognized face on earth. But beyond the adulation, beyond the parades and the gilded titles, she still sought what she had always sought: the balance between power and love, between duty and heart. And in that long twilight of her reign, she found both her crown and her peace, not in marble or medals, but in memory itself. The year was 1887, and the world had learned to live by her calendar. 50 years had passed since the coronation of the young girl who once trembled beneath the crown's weight, and now that same girl, silver-haired and veiled, ruled over a world that spanned from Arctic ice to Indian jungle. Time itself seemed to orbit her. To her subjects, she was not merely a monarch, but a living era, a symbol of continuity in a world that would not stop changing. And yet, in the quiet spaces between ceremonies, Queen Victoria still thought of herself as a woman, a widow, a mother, and the keeper of ghosts. Preparations for her Golden Jubilee began a year in advance. The empire would celebrate, they said, as it had never celebrated before. From Canada to the Cape, from Hong Kong to Melbourne, the colonies sent tributes: carved ivory from India, furs from Canada, spices and silks, gold and song. London became a city of banners. Flags draped every lamppost, church bells rehearsed their peals, and bakers lined the streets with sugared portraits of the Queen. Even the fog seemed to lift for the occasion, as though the weather itself wished to pay respect. She watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The faces that filled the capital were not merely English, they were the faces of the empire itself. Dark-skinned soldiers in scarlet coats marched beside Scots in tartan, Canadians in beaver fur caps, and Australians with the sun still on their skin. A Sikh regiment from India rode past on horses, their turbans shining with jewels. Maori leaders in cloaks of feathers followed them. It was the empire made flesh, gathered beneath her balcony. How strange, she wrote, that a single life should see so much of the world assembled before it. The Jubilee procession was an event of mythic scale. On the morning of June 21st, 1887, London awoke before dawn. The streets were seas of faces, windows crowded with waving handkerchiefs. The smell of horses, flowers, and summer heat mixed in the air. As her carriage rolled from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey, the roar of the crowd swelled and folded like waves breaking against stone. She raised her gloved hand in acknowledgement, the gesture small but steady. Her figure, round, severe, dignified, became the axis upon which all the noise turned. Inside the abbey, the ceremony unfolded like a dream she had seen before and forgotten. The choir sang Te Deum Laudamus, the same hymn that had echoed at her coronation 50 years earlier. The air smelled of incense and candle wax, of history burning softly. As she sat beneath the vaulted roof, she thought of those who had stood with her half a century ago. Albert, Leighton, Melbourne, Disraeli, all gone. She alone remained, a witness to her own myth. I was trembling then, she would later write, and now I tremble again, but for different reasons. Then for fear, now for remembrance. The day ended with fireworks above the Thames, their reflection rippling across the dark water like scattered jewels. The crowd sang, "God Save the Queen," until their voices cracked. In the glow of those final sparks, she glimpsed something almost divine. The empire as a single organism, breathing with one rhythm, all hearts joined for an instant. Yet beneath that unity, she sensed the first fault lines of exhaustion. The empire's light was brilliant, but brilliance is only the last stage before flame turns to smoke. After the Jubilee, she withdrew again to Balmoral, seeking quiet after the spectacle. The Scottish air smelled of pine and peat. The hills glowed green after rain. Here she could breathe without ceremony. Abdul Karim still attended her, writing down Urdu phrases as she dictated letters. The household whispered, as it always had, but she no longer cared for gossip. "They do not know me," she wrote, "and I do not wish to be known." She rode through the glens in a pony cart, the air sharp on her face, her body heavier now, but her mind as restless as ever. She thought often of her children. There were 9 of them now grown, scattered across Europe like seeds carried by wind. Her eldest daughter, Vicky, was Crown Princess of Prussia, proud, intellectual, forever writing her mother letters of advice. Alice was gone, dead of diphtheria along with one of her own daughters, the pain of that loss still sharp years later. Alfred served in the Navy, Arthur in the army. Leopold had died too young, his fragile body a reminder of mortality's cruelty. Beatrice, her youngest, remained with her still, the companion of her old age, the gentle echo of the life that had once filled the palace. And yet, as the decades passed, the children of her children grew into something larger than family. They became Europe's future, and in time its tragedy. Edward, her eldest son, would inherit the British throne. Wilhelm, her German grandson, would one day lead the Kaiserreich. Alexandra, another granddaughter, would become Tsarina of Russia. To outsiders, it seemed the perfect tapestry of peace, one family united across the continent. But Victoria, ever perceptive, sensed the dissonance beneath. "They are too proud," she said once of her grandsons. "Too quick to anger, too slow to understand." The 1890s brought prosperity, invention, and pride, the empire at its shimmering height. Electric lights turned night into day. Telephones carried voices across the city. Motorcars appeared like mechanical beasts prowling through London fog. The skyline filled with cranes and spires, the docks with ships bound for Africa, Asia, Australia. Her empire stretched now across a quarter of humanity, 400 million souls living, laboring, and praying in her name. It was said that if she wanted to send a message to any of them, she could reach them in less than an hour by telegraph. She, who had once written letters by candlelight, now ruled through lightning. Yet progress had its shadow. Reports reached her of famine in India, of strikes in Manchester, of uprisings in Africa. Each dispatch was a reminder that empire was not unity, but pressure, an equilibrium held by force. "They tell me the empire is happy," she wrote in her journal, "but I feel the restlessness of it, like the sea beneath the calm." She began to pray more often, less for victory than for wisdom. "May God make us worthy," she murmured, "of what we have built." In 1897 came another celebration, her Diamond Jubilee, 60 years on the throne. This time the world itself seemed to kneel. From every continent they came, rulers, diplomats, soldiers, and emissaries, all to honor a woman whose lifetime had become their timeline. The procession that year was the greatest in living memory. Soldiers from 50 nations of the empire filled the streets, each uniform a story of conquest and allegiance. Elephants and camels paraded beside carriages. Choirs from the colonies sang hymns in dozens of tongues. When Victoria appeared, the cheering was overwhelming. She was 80 years old now, her frame small beneath the heavy black gown, her hand gloved and trembling as she waved. The carriages moved slowly through the avenue of flags and flowers. Crowds wept openly. For many, she was the only ruler they had ever known, the thread connecting generations. To them, she was time itself. In the royal diary that night she wrote, "It was as though love itself surrounded me, not for me, but for what I have come to represent." But even as she smiled for the crowds, her heart was tired. The day's triumphs felt like a farewell. She had lived long enough to see her own image turned into legend, her sorrow transformed into sanctity. Yet when the trumpets fell silent and the streets emptied, the silence of her private rooms returned like an old companion. Abdul Karim read to her from Persian poetry, and she listened with closed eyes. "The world," she whispered, "is a beautiful and terrible thing." Her later years were filled with letters, endless letters to children, ministers, missionaries, and commoners alike. She wrote condolences to widows, congratulations to soldiers, reprimands to politicians, and prayers to the sick. Her handwriting, though slower, remained firm. "To reign," she once said, "is to write without ceasing." Her desk at Osborne House overflowed with correspondence. On its surface lay a small silver frame holding Albert's portrait, beside which burned a single candle every night. Her relationship with her son Edward mellowed in those final years. The quarrels of youth gave way to cautious affection. He was still impatient, still fond of pleasures she did not approve. but she began to see in him not threat, but continuity. "He will not be Albert," she confided, "but perhaps he will be good in his own way." When he knelt before her to kiss her hand after a state dinner, she rested her palm gently upon his cheek, a gesture so simple that it brought tears to his eyes. It was, at last, forgiveness. As she aged, the empire's myth and her family's legacy intertwined. Photographs of her surrounded by children and grandchildren circulated across the world, printed on postcards and souvenirs. Her image hung in classrooms and post offices from London to Lahore. To see her face was to feel belonging or subjection, depending on where one stood. She understood that contradiction more than her admirers knew. "It is a heavy thing," she once said, "to be loved and feared by the same world." By the late 1890s, illness began to slow her, but her mind remained lucid. "I dream of Albert more often now," she told Beatrice. "He stands by the window and smiles, but he says nothing." She spent long hours in the garden at Osborne, wrapped in shawls, watching the tide move against the Isle of Wight's rocky shore. Visitors described her as serene, but she felt the ticking of life's clock too clearly to mistake serenity for peace. "I have lived long enough," she wrote, "to see all that I loved become memory, and yet I cannot leave it." In those twilight years, she began to sense the fragility of all she had built. The alliances of her children, once her pride, began to sour. Tensions simmered between Britain and Germany. Revolutions whispered through Russia. She saw it in her grandchildren's letters, in the tone of their governments. "They are all of one blood," she lamented, "and yet they will tear each other apart." History would later prove her right, though she would not live to see it. When the century turned, Victoria was 81. The world she had entered as a child of candlelight now glowed with electricity. She had outlived her contemporaries, her husband, her friends, even the faith in progress that had once defined her age. The Jubilee medals glittered in museum cases. The Empire's banners fluttered in faraway winds. Yet in her private diary, she wrote only this: "I am so very tired, and I long for my rest." All the world's thrones were filled with her children, and the seeds of war lay in their cradles. She did not know that the alliances she had woven with love would one day unravel into catastrophe, that the cousins who laughed together at her table would face one another across battlefields. For now, the future still bowed to her, unaware of what it owed her and what it would destroy. The Diamond Jubilee had been her apotheosis, her transformation from sovereign to symbol, from woman to myth. And though she did not seek immortality, it found her all the same. The era that bore her name stretched across continents and generations. It was an age of glory and grief, invention and empire, and at its centre stood the small, veiled figure who had once been a lonely child in Kensington. As the century neared its close, and the long shadow of her reign stretched across the threshold of a new world, Queen Victoria watched the sun sink over Osborne House. "How strange," she murmured to her lady-in-waiting, "to have lived so long." The bells of London, far away, would one day toll her passing, but for now they rang only in celebration, of empire, of endurance, of the woman who had become the memory of an age. The last years of Victoria's life unfolded like the closing pages of an immense novel, each chapter heavy with memory, each day written in slow, deliberate ink. The world around her had grown faster, louder, more mechanical. She, meanwhile, moved through the corridors of Osborne House and Windsor Castle, like an echo of another century. Her reign had begun with candlelight and horse-drawn carriages. It now ended beneath the hum of electricity and the rattle of the motor car. History itself had shifted shape, and yet she endured, small, veiled, determined, the last steady heartbeat of an empire that was learning to measure time by machines rather than monarchs. The twilight years began in the glow of triumph. Her diamond jubilee of 1897 had lifted her into near myth. The newspapers called her Mother of the Empire, Queen of the World, Grandmother of Europe. Her likeness adorned medals, teacups, postage stamps, and schoolroom walls. To millions across the globe, she was not only sovereign but symbol, the constant presence in a life of upheaval. Yet behind that grandeur, her body was failing. The years of widowhood, childbirth, and ceaseless travel had bent her spine and stiffened her joints. Her breath came shorter now. Her hands shook when she wrote. She joked that her doctors treated her as a living relic, and perhaps she was right. At Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, she found what peace she could. The house, designed by Albert decades earlier, remained her sanctuary. Its pale walls and Italian terraces overlooked the Solent, where ships passed like silent prayers. She would sit by the window in her wheeled chair, wrapped in shawls, and watch the tide creep across the sand. Servants moved with reverent quiet. The ticking of clocks filled the hallways like a subdued choir. "How still it is here," she wrote, "and how faithful the sea, coming and going as it always has." The constancy of the waves comforted her. The empire might stretch to the ends of the earth, but here, time returned to its human rhythm. Her table was still stacked with papers, reports from India, letters from governors, petitions from soldiers, notes from her children. She insisted on reading them all, her eyes peering through thick spectacles. Even as her health declined, she remained a monarch first. Her ministers marveled at her discipline. "The Queen's intellect is unimpaired," one wrote, "and her grasp of affairs astonishing." Yet she no longer wrote with the fervour of her youth. Her sentences shortened. Her marginal notes grew gentler. The iron will remained, but its edge had softened. "We do what we can," she would say quietly, "and the rest we leave to God." In public, she still appeared unbreakable. Crowds gathered whenever she ventured out, cheering as her carriage passed. To them, she was an emblem of endurance. To herself, she was simply performing the final duties of a life that had long ceased to belong to her. "They must not see me fade," she told her physician, and so she sat upright before them, jewels at her throat, her black veil heavy as ever. The cheers washed over her like the sound of a distant sea. When she returned home, she removed the regalia with relief, laying it aside like armor. "I am so tired of being looked at," she confessed to Beatrice. "It is like being a statue that cannot move." Her friendship with Abdul Karim endured despite scandal and resistance. He remained her confidant, her teacher in all matters Indian. Together they read Persian poetry, translated verses of Hafiz, and discussed the festivals of his homeland. The court bristled at his presence, but she refused to yield. "He has served me with truth and devotion," she declared, "and I will not cast him off because others are prejudiced." As her health weakened, he became her comfort. He accompanied her on short carriage rides through Osborne's gardens, and sometimes she would rest her head against the seat and murmur words in Urdu that made him smile. "You are my Munshi," she said once, "and I am your pupil still." But even friendship could not protect her from the ache of years. Her eyesight dimmed, her hearing faltered. Clocks had to be wound louder for her to notice them. She slept more, though her sleep was shallow and filled with dreams of faces long gone. She spoke often of Albert now, as if he were waiting in the next room. "He comes to me sometimes," she told Beatrice, "and I am comforted." Her attendants learned to recognize the moments when memory overwhelmed her. She would reach suddenly toward the empty air, as if expecting to find his hand. Then, realizing, she would smile faintly, whisper a prayer, and return to her papers. Outside her quiet sanctuaries, the world was changing beyond recognition. Automobiles sputtered along the mall. Phonographs carried voices through horned brass. The first moving pictures flickered in London theatres. She was fascinated, though she pretended disdain. "So strange," she said of the motor car, "and rather alarming." She listened once to a recorded song and laughed, astonished. How odd to hear what is no longer there. The modern age had begun to hum around her, but she remained, as she had always been, the still point in its turning. The empire, too, was at its height, vast, glittering and trembling beneath its own weight. The wars in Africa filled her last years with anxiety. The Boer conflict in particular wounded her deeply. Reports of British losses reached her daily. She read the casualty lists with trembling hands. "My poor soldiers," she wrote, "so far from home, and so little understood." She sent thousands of handwritten letters to widows and mothers, each one sealed with her personal crest. "No life lost in service," she wrote to one family, "is unseen by the Queen." Yet even her compassion could not ease the bitterness of the war, which revealed the cracks in the empire's image of benevolence. "We must be firm," she told her ministers, "but also merciful." Her son Edward visited often, his manner softened by middle age. Their long years of tension had cooled into affection, cautious but sincere. He brought his wife Alexandra, who charmed the household with her warmth. The Queen, once so critical of her son's frivolity, now looked upon him with weary tenderness. "He has grown wise," she admitted, "and I have grown old enough to see it." She gave him increasing responsibility for state functions, preparing him quietly for what would come. When he knelt to kiss her hand, she placed her palm on his forehead, a benediction more maternal than royal. "You will do well," she whispered. "Promise me you will keep them united." Her grandchildren visited in intervals, filling the palace with bursts of laughter and foreign accents. They came from every corner of Europe, Prussia, Russia, Denmark, Greece, each carrying both the pride and the peril of her bloodline. She watched them play on the lawns at Osborne, and felt a strange mixture of joy and foreboding. "They are the future," she wrote, "and they do not yet know how fragile peace can be." She sensed the rivalries building beneath the politeness of diplomacy, the tension between Germany and England, the slow, inevitable drift toward conflict. "When I am gone," she said once, "they must learn to love each other, or they will destroy all we have made." By 1900, her strength was visibly fading. The doctors spoke in euphemisms: fatigue, exhaustion, the strain of age. But she knew what they meant. She moved now by wheelchair, her breath shallow, her appetite failing. Still she refused idleness. "I must work until I can no longer think," she said. When Parliament sent her dispatches on the progress of the Boer War, she annotated them carefully. Her handwriting wavered but did not fail. She received generals, ambassadors, even a young Winston Churchill, and though she spoke softly, her words carried weight. "Remember," she told one minister, "that our power must not make us cruel." Christmas of 1900 passed quietly at Osborne. The house smelled of pine and candle wax. The family gathered in small numbers, aware that this might be their last holiday together. Victoria watched the younger generations exchange gifts and laughter. She smiled, though her eyes were tired. "It is a good thing," she said softly, "to see life continue." After dinner, she asked for the musicians to play Home Sweet Home. When the final notes faded, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Soon." In January 1901, her decline quickened. She slept often, drifting in and out of lucidity. At times she spoke to Albert as though he were beside her. "Do not go far," she murmured. "I shall follow." Beatrice, ever faithful, stayed by her bed. Abdul waited outside the door, praying quietly. The household moved with reverent silence. Doctors came and went, helpless before the calm inevitability of time. The Queen's final days were filled with soft light and murmured hymns. She asked once more to see her children, then clasped Beatrice's hand. "Let me go," she whispered. On the evening of January 22nd, 1901, as dusk settled over the Isle of Wight, Queen Victoria breathed her last. The candle beside her bed burned low, the sea beyond the window grey and still. The attendants bowed their heads. The nurse drew the curtains. Word travelled by telegraph across continents, faster than any messenger horse could have dreamed. In London, bells tolled. In Delhi, Calcutta, Melbourne and Cape Town, flags fell to half-mast. For the first time in 63 years, Britain had no queen. Her body lay in state at Osborne, then was borne by ship to Portsmouth, and from there to London. The journey itself felt like a ritual of farewell between centuries. Crowds lined the tracks, their hats removed in silence as the funeral train passed. She had outlived her time. Now the time itself seemed to bow as she departed. At Windsor Castle her coffin rested beside Albert's, as she had wished. Upon it lay white flowers and a small sprig of myrtle from her wedding bouquet. A circle finally closed. Her funeral was attended by kings, queens, emperors and princes, the largest gathering of royalty the world had ever seen. The air was thick with frost and the scent of morning lilies. The empires of Europe stood shoulder to shoulder, bound by the memory of one woman whose life had touched them all. In the choir of St. George's Chapel, the hymns rose and fell like the tide she had loved so much. And when the final Amen echoed, the age that bore her name ended with it. She had entered the throne a child of candlelight, and left it in the dawn of electricity. She had seen the rise of railways, the birth of photography, the conquest of continents, and the invention of flight. Empires had been born and broken beneath her gaze. The Victorian century, her century, had defined progress and paradox alike, and though history would judge its triumphs and cruelties, it could never forget its queen. As the century died, so did its queen, and an era passed into legend. The bells of London told her memory, their echoes stretching across oceans. In drawing rooms and factories, in colonies and capitals, people paused, as if the world itself had stopped breathing for a moment. Then, slowly, the machinery resumed, telegraphs clicking, trains steaming, children laughing. The age of Victoria had ended, but her shadow remained, vast and golden, cast across the threshold of the new century, like the last light of a setting sun. The bells that tolled for Victoria's passing seemed to echo far longer than sound should allow. They rolled through the valleys of England, across the seas she had never sailed, over the colonies that bore her name, and into the century that waited beyond her shadow. The 19th century closed its doors, and with it, the world that she had ruled, its customs, its faith, its sense of certitude. Yet even as the morning draped itself over the empire like a black veil, a new dawn was already rising. The telegraphs still clicked, the trains still thundered, and the cities still hummed with smoke and progress. The Queen was gone, but the world she had shaped continued to move, propelled by the momentum of her reign. In the days following her funeral, London moved as though in a trance. Newspapers printed her image framed by laurel wreaths and angels. Shopkeepers dressed their windows in black crepe. Schoolchildren carried portraits of her through the streets. Across the empire, from Melbourne to Montreal, church bells tolled in slow, uneven rhythm. In India, where dawn came sooner, villagers gathered in silence, some lighting candles before the small painted portraits of their Rani Victoria. The empire she had ruled now performed its first act without her, an empire that covered a quarter of the earth and held a quarter of its people. Few reigns in human history had been so long, or so vast in consequence. When Victoria had ascended the throne in 1837, Britain was a nation of carriages and coal, its power local, its technology young. When she died, it was an empire of steel, cables, and steamships, its reach planetary, its confidence unshakable. The name Victorian had become shorthand for an entire civilization, for progress and prudence, invention and restraint, the twin illusions of moral certainty and endless expansion. And at the heart of that civilization had stood one woman, her life the thread that wove together revolution and continuity. Yet what truly was her legacy? Some said it was empire, that glittering map of crimson that stretched across oceans and deserts, proclaiming Britain's dominion. Others said it was virtue, the moral code she had embodied, family, duty, decorum, the sanctity of work and marriage. Some claimed her legacy was progress itself, the steam and science that transformed the human condition. But perhaps her truest legacy lay not in what she built, but in what she symbolized. The endurance of the human spirit through change, the ability to weather loss, and still rise to duty. She had been daughter, wife, mother, widow, and empress. Through each transformation she carried her people with her, reflecting their aspirations as much as their fears. Her empire, at the dawn of the 20th century, seemed eternal. British ships sailed on every sea. British law ruled over continents. British goods filled the markets of the world. In distant colonies, governors toasted her name. In London, ministers spoke of the imperial family as if it were unbreakable. Yet the seeds of fracture were already sown. Within 13 years of her death, that same family of nations, ruled by her grandsons and granddaughters, would plunge into the First Global War. Her heirs, bound by blood yet divided by pride, would send millions of her subjects to battle across Europe. The peace she had personified would crumble into dust. Still, in those early years after her passing, the illusion held. Statues rose in every capital, her name carved into stone and memory alike. Towns called themselves Victoria. Streets, bridges, and lakes bore her title. Her face continued to circulate on coins and postage, even in places she had never imagined. In Canada and Australia, children still sang her anthem. In India, processions still marched under her banner. For decades, the empire seemed to dream of her, its lost matriarch, its conscience of iron and lace. The very idea of queen became synonymous with her. And yet, behind the marble and melody, time did what it always does. It unraveled. The empire that had seemed infinite began to fray. The colonies demanded voices of their own. Revolutions whispered in distant provinces. The machines she had admired became weapons of unprecedented destruction. By the middle of the 20th century, much of the world she had ruled would no longer belong to Britain at all. Her statues gathered dust beneath new flags, her name weathered by unfamiliar tongues. But still she remained, half memory, half myth, an emblem of continuity in an age that had forgotten how to stand still. What endures of Victoria is not merely history, but atmosphere. The image of the small, veiled woman at her desk, pen in hand, surrounded by dispatch boxes and framed portraits. The steadfastness of her gaze, the blend of tenderness and command in her letters. Her world was one of paradoxes, moral restraint amid imperial ambition, progress shadowed by poverty, invention intertwined with exploitation. She did not create those contradictions, but she embodied them, ruling through the impossible balance of faith and pragmatism. Her reign became a mirror, reflecting both the greatness and the guilt of her age. And so she lingers, even now in the imagination, a queen without equal, both distant and familiar. To some, she is the Iron Matriarch who presided over the zenith of empire. To others, the lonely widow who mourned her husband until her own heart ceased. Between those two visions lies the truth of her humanity, ordinary and immense. She lived longer than many nations survive. She felt grief deeper than most monarchs dared show. She loved fiercely, ruled cautiously, and endured absolutely. If empire was her monument, then time itself was her cathedral. Within its echoing halls, her footsteps are still faintly heard. The girl walking down the aisle of Westminster, the mother watching her children marry into Europe's dynasties, the widow sitting by her fire at Osborne, writing letters to a world she could no longer visit. The sound of her pen became the heartbeat of her age, and when it stopped, an entire century seemed to exhale. She dreamed of eternal empire, but what endured was her shadow, a long, quiet silhouette cast across the threshold of modernity. It falls still across history, soft but unbroken, reminding us that beneath every crown beats a mortal heart, and that even the greatest empires begin and end in the solitude of a single human life.